You can close the door.
Okay. Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Am I can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hold on, I can't hear you. Hello?
Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Ejem, if you can hear me, could you put your thumbs up? Okay, so I can't hear you. So what's going wrong here? Hello? Okay, give me.
Did you turn the microphone on? Because
Huh?
on the computer, if you turn the right
Hold on.
microphone.
Okay. Do you want to say something now?
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Just give me a bit of time. Does that help? Try saying something now.
Can you hear us, Lucas, now?
Yeah, okay. I had some widget and it just screwed everything up. Okay. Yeah, so I hope everyone had a good Bairam. I went to a conference in India, which was lots of fun, but I had a very long journey back. It took me about 20 hours. And so I'm feeling a little bit sick. Now, I don't think it's COVID. I think it's just because I had a very long journey and I'm just, my body, I had one night. I don't know if, has anyone ever been to India? For some reason, all of the flights to India are sort of overnight flights. And so I had one day without any sleep. So I'm sort of still recovering from that. So what I'm thinking is that tomorrow, I mean, I'm a bit under the weather. So I thought tomorrow, maybe I should cancel class tomorrow and then we can reschedule it for the 25th. So classes are supposed to finish on the 24th and we can kind of redo it on the 25th. Does that work for people? Yeah, I'll send an email. Yeah.
Are you going to do an online class on 25th?
Well, the plan would be to do a face-to-face class, but of course, when I do a face-to-face class, I do the Zoom recording as well.
Okay.
Why? Because are you going to be leaving before then?
No, I have an oral exam that day.
Okay.
For a Spanish course, yeah.
Yeah, so I will record it. I don't want to make tomorrow's class online because we only have 1 hour a week face-to-face. And I was thinking, you know, face-to-face is fun and we should sort of, it's better to keep that, I think, to keep the some face-to-face. And maybe I'll get a bit tired today. So I'm not on my most awake. So it would be my kind of subconscious talking to you about Wittgenstein. Yeah, maybe that's good though. Maybe it'll be all the kind of dark, bubbling, subconscious Wittgenstein interpretation.
Sorry, will you also cancel 480 tomorrow?
Yeah, so I think I'll do the same thing for 480 tomorrow, because I'm thinking that, you know, I haven't had a test. I don't feel that bad, but I'm being a bit careful. I'm keeping away from Zubaydi and Alijan, and just yeah, you know, I was on an aeroplane for like 6 hours, and yeah, and at the conference I was interacting with people. But I think the COVID is in a very low peak at the moment. But I think just to be safe, I guess it's better. Yeah. So, and I was thinking of doing the same thing for 480. Like, because our classes finish on Tuesday, we can just do an extra class on the Wednesday. Okay, so
Because,
yeah,
before we start, can I ask a question?
yeah.
We talked with some friends in the WhatsApp group.
Yeah.
It was a very busy week. We have exam almost every day. Can you delay the midterm deadline?
Okay, when do you want it to? Let me go to. Okay, wrong class. Hold on. So let's have a look. When is the deadline now? So the deadline is
Thursday.
Thursday. And when would you like the deadline for? Like Sunday?
If it's okay, it's okay for us, I guess.
Okay, so what date would that be?
Thank you.
So that would be the 15th. Yeah, shall I do that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Good. Okay, I've changed it on. Sorry. Okay, I've changed it on Moodle. Okay, so is that good? Yeah. So Zeynep, yeah, the conference was fun. It was only the second time I've been to a conference since COVID started. So it was really, the first time I went was to the ASOS conference in September, and that was all open air. This one we did inside, but it was a small group of people. It was more like a workshop, and COVID is in a sort of trough. And the conference was last week, and then I stayed a bit longer. So I thought that I didn't want, after all that interacting, I didn't want to immediately come back and be with Zubeyde and Alican. So I stayed, and I kind of hung around a little bit with people inside, but only on a sort of one-to-one basis. Yeah, so it was really fun. It's really nice to be doing philosophy face-to-face. Yeah, the ASOS conference this year, I don't know if people have been to ASOS before, but they have this philosophy in ASOS every summer. It's the first week, it's normally the first week of July, and it sort of got messed up over COVID times, but it's happening again this July. And this July is going to be on John Locke. So if any of you are into British empiricism, it might be fun.
Will you be there?
I will not be giving a paper. So I gave a paper at the last one, which was in September. And that was on, I gave a paper on Wittgenstein and Reid, of Wittgenstein's uncertainty. But yeah, I'll probably be there with Alican, but probably won't. Yeah, I won't be giving a paper because I'm not really a Locke scholar.
Okay, I'm planning to go as well. Just
yeah,
to
no.
listen.
I mean, in the past, I had a kind of what's it called? A couple of projects, and I managed to get money from my project to rent a bus that would go from Boğaziçi to ASOS, and we'd have a kind of busload of students and teachers, and we'd, it was like the magical mystery bus. We'd get in the morning and we'd basically spend the whole day on the bus, and it was lots of fun. But the ASOS conference is a really nice way of doing philosophy. You're on the beach, you get to meet with people. If you don't have that much money, you can do sort of beach camping. So there are sort of camping places, and it's sort of fun. Okay, yeah. So today I may not be particularly. I'm feeling a little bit. I think it's mainly due to when you miss a night's sleep. Yeah, it sort of messes with your head. And then since I've got back, there's been Alican. So what I want you to talk about today is we're going to talk about the Tractatus. And what I want you to talk about today is I want you to talk about the beginning and the end, the sort of preface and the conclusion, the framing of it, which is the sort of weird stuff. And then and in the preface and the conclusion, he sort of suggests that everything he says in the book is nonsense. So one of the big questions for interpreting Wittgenstein is kind of how are we to read this? Is it a joke? You know, is he just taking the piss? Is it a big kind of, is it all meant to be read ironically? So one question is about the framing of the book. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And the sort of idea is that it looks like how the book works is he's presenting a theory about meaning, about how language has meaning. And then according to this theory of meaning, it then looks like everything he says about the theory of meaning is meaningless. So given the theory of meaning he's trying to explain, the theory of meaning he's trying to explain is meaningless. And then it's what are we to make of that? That what he wants to say in this book can't be expressed. So that's going to be the first thing. So just about the framing of this. Then the second thing I want to talk about is about the theory of meaning. And just before the break, we talked about the first three big claims of the book. First of all, he's got a claim about the world. And we talked last time about his account of the world. The world consists of facts. Facts are actual states of affairs. Facts consist of objects that are somehow combined together. Yeah, so we talked a bit about his theory of the world. And then after he's given the theory of the world, he offers a theory of pictures, how pictures work. Yeah, and so there's a discussion of pictures. And then the claim is that language is a particular type of picturing. Yeah, so sentences are pictures of reality. Sentences somehow are pictures of the world. And this is the sort of theory of meaning that Wittgenstein seems to offer in the Tractatus. It's this picture theory of meaning. Yeah. And one of the key claims of the picture theory of meaning is that in order for a picture to be able to succeed in picturing, the picture and the thing pictured need to have something in common. They need to have some sort of shared form. And the form that allows a picture to do its picturing can't be pictured. Yep. It can be shown, but not said. Yeah. And so in the case of a painting and reality share a similar form. The form they share is that they're both spatial. So in an everyday picture, like a picture on a wall, a painted picture, a painting, the shared form between the picture and the thing pictured is spatial form. And Wittgenstein wants to say that in language manages to represent reality because language and reality have to share the same form. Yeah, and the form they share is not spatial, but it's logical form. So somehow, in order for language to represent reality, language and reality have to have a shared form, a shared logical form. Now, that sounds crazy. It turns out that, as we said last time, we have the kind of Wittgensteinian fight club. Yeah, is that, you know, you can't say anything about logical form. Yeah, that it's off limits. Yeah, the first rule of Wittgenstein Club is you can't say anything about logical form. Yeah, you can only whistle it. That's basically the idea. So and then if we've got time, so first of all, I want to talk about the beginning and the end, the framing of the Tractatus, and this claim about how everything in the Tractatus is nonsense. So, because I claim is if you understand the book correctly, you'll realize that everything in it is nonsense. And then you're supposed to be, come on, Ludwig. I mean, is this a joke? I mean, what on earth is going on in this claim? Yeah, this is something. Yeah. The second thing we're going to look at is the picture theory of meaning. And then if we've got time, we're going to talk about Wittgenstein's view of the self or the I. Yep. And once again, that the I, me, the self, is something that maybe can be can't be said. It can only be shown. Yeah, so what he has to say about meaningless and nonsense, it turns out that all sort of all reference to the metaphysical subject also turns out to be nonsense. Now we can talk about bodies in the world. I can talk about Atesh's body. You can talk about Atesh's kind of biography. But this idea of the I as subject, as opposed to the I as an object amongst other objects in the world, according to the theory of meaning that Wittgenstein seems to put forward, we also can't say anything about the metaphysical subject. We can't say anything about God, and we can't say anything about values. We can't say anything about ethics. So they're the kind of three topics that oops, I've just lost everyone. They're the three topics that I want to talk about today. Okay, so let's start off by, and I mean, for this Wittgenstein stuff, oops, I think one thing I want to do is, I just want to read some of this in case you haven't read it, and I'm having a problem moving up and down. How do I do this? Select tool. Hold on. How do I change this to the help? View. So I want to, okay, everything's cool. Sorry. Okay, yeah. So I want to start off by looking at the preface and the conclusion. Who read some more of the Tractatus over the holiday? Who went to the beach and sort of sat on the beach and thought, oh, what I'm going to do is read the Tractatus? Did lots of people come up to you and start talking to you on the beach about Wittgenstein and kind of, no, no, that's it. Yeah, I guess. How did you find it? Zeynep, was it hard? Did it make any sense to you? What did you make of it?
I didn't finish it, but I think it's really fun because I also love logic. So it was really great, and I really loved how he used numbers like 2.1, 2.12. Like it is so easy to follow in an argument.
Yeah. I mean, it's weird though, because it's very compact. There are bits of it that are very clear, and then there are bits of it that are like, what on earth is he talking about? He wrote this during the First World War in the trenches, where he could die at any minute. So part of it is like, you know, maybe I'm going to die, so I should just get it down quickly and compactly. And I think it's also quite poetic. So I think it's kind of, it's very, one thing about Wittgenstein, it's all about logic, but I think the Tractatus and the Investigations are very much literary works. So I think Wittgenstein himself thought the Tractatus was a bit like a poem. Yeah, so it's there. For a book that deals with logic and the philosophy of language, it's unusually poetic. Now, so this is what he says in the preface. He says, this book deals with the problems of philosophy and shows, I believe, so it shows, it doesn't say, so this distinction between showing and saying is going to be really important, that the reason why these problems are posed is that the logic of our language is misunderstood. So the idea is that we've got these philosophical problems, and that these problems only arise because of the fact that the logic of our language, the way language works, is misunderstood. And the idea is, you know, the sort of thought is going to be that if we understand language properly and how language works, these problems of philosophy, I guess, they're not going to be solved, yeah, because, but they're going to be sort of sidestepped, yeah, that if we understand how language works, then the problems are going to be dissolved in a certain way. Yeah, this is the thought. And I take it that the way they're going to be dissolved, one interpretation is that we're going to see that all of these problems of philosophy turn out to be meaningless. Yeah, that we're using language in ways that is inappropriate. And this, in the later, I mean, one sort of question is Wittgenstein, as a Wittgenstein interpretation, that has to do with how to understand the relationship between the Tractatus and the philosophical investigations, how much continuity is there. And in the investigations, Wittgenstein offers a very different view of language. But there he also has the sort of project of dissolving philosophical problems. Yeah, so in the philosophical investigation, he thinks that we've got these various language games. We've got, and language there is not understood in terms of picturing, but we have the idea of language understood as a pragmatic way, meaning rather than meaning being correspondence or picturing, meaning is understood in terms of use. Yeah, the meaning of a word is how we use it. And when it comes to our everyday language, we know how to use words in an everyday context. But in philosophy, we're sort of using words outside of their normal context. Yep. And Wittgenstein in the investigation suggests that philosophical problems arise when sort of language goes on holiday. Yeah, so we've got something we know how to interact on, in Istanbul. And then you go to India and you're trying to do the same things, and it's like, everyone's wobbling their heads around. It's like, hold on a minute, I've got no idea what's going on. Yeah. So language goes on holiday. That's what happens in philosophy. Yeah, that you've got tools that make perfect sense. You can use perfectly well in the office, but in a different context, you don't know what to do with it. Yeah, so we've got the idea that you get both in the earlier Wittgenstein and the later Wittgenstein, that problems of philosophy have got to do with some sort of misunderstanding or misuse of language. Yeah, and so the way to approach philosophical problems isn't directly, but in terms of thinking about the language used. So I think Wittgenstein, here very much represents what Richard Rorty called the linguistic turn in philosophy. Yeah, where we instead of talking about knowledge, instead of talking about the self, we talk about the language, or the language used to talk about these things. Yeah, so this is the idea. And the whole sense of the book might be summed up in the following words. What can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence. Yeah. Now, it turns out that we can't say anything clearly about ethics, about God, about the self. We can't say anything clearly about how language works. Yeah. So what can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence. And so the sort of thought is, if that's what you think, you should have stopped there. Like, I've got the book, and that, this is it. Yeah. Yeah. So one thing is that now he says the aim of this book is to draw a limit to thought, or rather not to thought, but to the expression of thought. So we use language to express thoughts, and so he says, for to be able to draw a limit to thought, we should have to find both sides of the limit thinkable. We should have to be able to think what cannot be thought. Now, here he's saying that he doesn't want to draw a limit to thought. It's going to turn out that he wants to draw a limit to the expression of thought. Yeah, so the sort of question here is, my sort of reading here, so there are these different readings of Wittgenstein. I tend to kind of have a similar reading to Chrissy, maybe, I don't know, but I mean, these two camps, whereas I think Wittgenstein does have this mystical side to him, and he does yeah, he thinks that what he's saying in this book can't be said, but it can be whistled. Yeah. So, if you want to draw a limit to thought, if you want to draw a limit to something, to limit something, in some sense, you have to understand both sides of the limit. Yeah. So suppose you want to draw the limit of thought, and you want to say, well, the limit of thought is here. And in order to be able to think of the limit, it looks like you have to sort of think both sides of the limit. So to be able to think of the limit of thought, you have to be able to think more than can be thought. If anyone's interested in the limits of thought, one of the philosophers I really like is Graham Priest, who's one of the best, most interesting logicians. And he's got a very nice book called Beyond the Limits of Thought, where it's a sort of book about logic, but he kind of deals with Hegel, Heidegger, sort of Japanese philosophy. He does a bunch of work on Indian logic. So this book, has anyone looked at any Graham Priest? Anyone heard of him? Yeah, you like him, Zeynep? Yeah, he's really fun.
He's so great.
Graham. Yeah, he came and visited a few years ago, and him and Stephen Reed, we had a day each. He kind of did a day on paraconsistent logics, but I'm going to put this.
He also gave an open lecture for the resistance with Feel Free.
Oh yeah, he's very good. Yeah. Was it a nice lecture?
Yeah, it was really great.
Yeah. So he's really cool. Yeah. So this is an interesting claim that he says. Well, so he says the aim of this book is to draw a limit to thought, and then he says, oh, not to thought, to the expression of thoughts. So it's to draw a limit on language, not on thought. Yeah. So in order to draw a limit to thought, we would have to find both sides of the limit thinkable. So it's the aim of the book is to draw a limit on language. So this is, I'm giving you a more kind of traditional view of Wittgenstein, of the Tractatus. So this is on this sort of traditional understanding of the Tractatus, that he does, in some sense, offer a theory of meaning that draws some sort of demarcation between what's meaningful and what's nonsense. So you've got this theory of meaning, and according to this theory of meaning, there are going to be things that can't be said. There are going to be linguistic expressions that, strictly speaking, are nonsensical. But on this reading, that these nonsensical expressions can help us, can show us something, can help us to see something. Yeah, these expressions don't literally say anything. Yeah, but they're expressions that can intimate something to us, that can make us aware of something in a certain way. Yeah. Maybe there are things that can be thought that can't be said. Maybe this is how I'm thinking about this paragraph. If you take this paragraph literally, it looks like the thought may, in some sense, what's thinkable may be greater than what's sayable. There are things that we can sort of get that can't be said directly. Yeah. In a poem, in poetry, you don't have literal use of language. Yes, but a poem can reveal something to you. But it can reveal something to you maybe that can't be said. And so my reading of this paragraph is that Wittgenstein is sort of suggesting that he wants to draw the limits of thought, limits of language. And that if you're drawing the limits of language, you've got a distinction between language that is meaningful and language that is, strictly speaking, nonsense. But it turns out that things that are, strictly speaking, nonsense can allow us to see things that we didn't say before. Yeah, so I take it that when he says what can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence. I'm not sure he really is committed to that, because there are things that we can't talk about that we can intimate through language that, strictly speaking, yeah. Metin. Atesh, sorry.
It's okay. I wonder why Wittgenstein is classified as an analytic philosopher. I mean, this seems to me like a poem itself because
Yeah.
it's all paradoxical and, you know, it's only about showing something, and also the investigations are sort of that way, I think. So why do you think he's classified as an analytic philosopher?
So, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question because you know, there's this sort of mystical, poetic side to Wittgenstein. It's very paradoxical. So, you know, like, I take it, I mean, the Tractatus is probably the founding text of analytic philosophy. Yeah. And I take it the reason for that is that this was read by the younger generation in Vienna. And so it was taken up by the Vienna Circle. And they basically took the theory of meaning and dropped the mysticism, dropped the poetry. So if you look at people like Carnap, I mean, one way of reading Wittgenstein, if you forget the intro, if you forget the preface and the end of the book, and then you just take it as offering a theory of meaning, then you can very clearly see how logical positivism emerged from Wittgenstein. So the logical positivists have offered this, you know, this sort of verificationist account of meaning, and and logical positivism looks to Wittgenstein, looks to Hume. So Hume says, anything that can't be traced back, any expression that can't be cashed out in terms of sensory experience is meaningless. Therefore, we should throw all of these metaphysics books onto the fire and burn them. So it doesn't look not a very good take today. So Hume is one of the first big kind of proponents of book burning. But he thinks the books that should be burned are these sort of metaphysics books. Yeah, because we've got all of these books in metaphysics that are using terms that turn out to be meaningless because they're not translatable into language of sense data or language of ideas. Yeah, they don't have any empirical content. And one way of looking at Wittgenstein is he's offering a theory of meaning that basically offers a demarcation between what's meaningful and what's nonsense. And then it turns out that the only kind of statements that are meaningful are going to be scientific statements. So only the kind of language of science, only the language of empirical science is going to be meaningful. Yeah, where we have language that is descriptive of the world. Yeah, the ethical language doesn't have any propositional content. It's not true or false. So after the, you know, logical positivism offers this sort of verificationist theory of meaning, and Carnap, for example. Anyone read Carnap recently? What's his? I'm just looking for. Hold on a second. So he has a very famous yeah, so Carnap has a very famous paper called, I'm just looking at the title, I always forget the title. I think it's
empiricism.
Called, it's the Elimination of Metaphysics article. Hold on, so let me find it on field papers. Carnap field papers. Oh, so give me 30 seconds. Yeah, so you're asking me about the relationship between Wittgenstein and analytic philosophy. Sorry. Okay, give me 30 seconds. Oh yeah, so this is the paper. Okay, I'm gonna share it. So it's the elimination of metaphysics through the logical analysis of language, and this is yeah. Yeah, this paper, like, if you look at the analytics, am I sharing now? There's been this huge resurgence of interest in Carnap in the last kind of, well, since Trump got elected. So there's been this resurgence of sort of leftist interest in Carnap. So I think, you know, since 1918 to now, it's gone from like almost 0 downloads to like, you know, 600 a month. Yeah, yeah. So there's been a big kind of resurgence of interest in this, and so Carnap. So this paper, the elimination of metaphysics through the logical analysis of language, I take it is one of the core texts of analytic philosophy, and I think it's basically taking something like Wittgenstein's theory of language seriously, and then saying, well, this offers us a way of ruling out of sort of yeah, so early analytic philosophy, well, analytic philosophy was very strongly anti-metaphysical. Yeah, so the analytic philosophers from the 1930s to the 1960s thought that the big thing about analytic philosophy was that it destroyed metaphysics. So you analyze language and you realize that all of these metaphysical claims are sort of nonsense. So Carnap in this article takes his example of nonsense. Does anyone know what example of nonsense he uses? Any idea which metaphysician?
Heidegger.
Yeah, who said that?
Me.
Zweide, yeah. So there's a famous passage from Heidegger where Heidegger says das Nichtet, that the nothing nothings. And this is sort of Carnap's paradigm example of nonsense. So if any of you are interested in, yeah, why is Wittgenstein taken to be, the Tractatus taken to be kind of at the center of analytic philosophy? Well, first of all, that he was taken up by the logical positivist, and a lot of the logical positivist understanding of language and its attack on metaphysics was basically based on the idea that we can have a theory of language that allows us to distinguish between meaningful claims and nonsense. And then they thought this distinction was the sort of distinction that Wittgenstein was advocating. Yeah. The problem with this claim that you can distinguish between meaningful claims and nonsense is it turns out that you can apply this to logical positivism itself. And it looks like all of the claims of Carnap turn out to be nonsense as well. This is what I think Wittgenstein would say. So if you have this theory of meaning, that any theory of meaning is also going to turn out to be nonsense on this theory of meaning. Yeah, so Wittgenstein is aware there's a sort of paradox here. That's the first reason. Yeah, so if you're interested, I gave the Carnap paper, and you can read it and you can think, you can see how someone could have read Wittgenstein and come away with some of these ideas. The second reason is that Wittgenstein is basically offering us the sort of what became the standard semantics for logic. Yeah, so in some sense, what Wittgenstein is doing in the Tractatus is not offering us an account of ordinary everyday language. Yeah, he's not offering a theory for the meaning of English. Yeah, but he's offering a theory of meaning for a sort of ideal language. And this ideal language is going to be expressed in the logic of Russell and Frege. So he's offering us a sort of theory of meaning for an ideal language. And then I take it the sort of claim is that everyday meaningful is everyday language is meaningful insofar as it can be sort of translated into this ideal language. Yeah, and that was Carnap's sort of project in the Aufbau, to offer a bridge between this sort of Wittgensteinian pure language of logic plus sense data, and how our language of everyday life can be sort of connected to this sort of idealized language that Wittgenstein's dealing with. So he's offering us a theory of meaning for this ideal language of logic. And he basically gives us the standard semantics for propositional logic in terms of truth tables. Yeah, so I think in terms of the philosophy of logic, that he's offering us an account of the meaning. Yeah, so one of the main claims of the second half of the Tractate, of the kind of second half of the Tractatus, is offering us an account of the meaning of the logical connectives in terms of truth tables. Yeah, so anyone interested in the philosophy of logic and how logic works, it has to read Wittgenstein, because he offers the kind of one of the kind of standard ways of understanding how logical symbolism, yeah. So I think that's why he's been so important in analytic philosophy. Okay, we didn't get very far so far. I mean, we got a bit distracted, so we managed to get through 2 paragraphs. How long have we got? Okay, so let's try and finish the preface. Okay, so yeah, so he says it will therefore only be in language that the limit could be drawn, and what lies on the other side of the limit will simply be nonsense. So in language, we can sort of distinguish between statements that are meaningful and statements that are nonsense. Now, so we've got sentences that can be written. So the thing about thoughts is, if you think you want to put a limit on thought, then you're going to have thoughts that can be thought and thoughts that can't be thought. And that doesn't seem to make much sense. So the idea is in language, there are definitely sentences that can be written. There are a series of words that can be put down on paper. Yeah, so the language exists. Yeah, so the objects that are meaningful and not meaningful are objects that exist. The idea of a thought that is nonsense, you might think it's the idea of a thought that can't be thought. Yeah, but a sentence that can't be understood, or a sentence that doesn't mean anything, there's nothing paradoxical about that. Yeah, so it will only be in language that the limit can be drawn, and what lies on the other side of the limit will simply be nonsense. So it looks like then you might think, well, what he wants to offer us in the Tractatus is an account of language, where we've got some clear way of distinguishing between meaningful claims and nonsense. I think that's how the analytic philosophers read him. He's offering us a criterion for distinguishing between what's meaningful and what's nonsense. And then we can take this criterion and we can apply it to Heidegger and say, Heidegger, you know, everything you say is rubbish. You know, we've got this criteria of meaningful language, and we can apply this, and we can use this to rule out certain things as nonsense. Now at the end of the preface, what does he say? Well, he seems to be very optimistic. He says there's 2 things. The thoughts, well, so yeah, so first of all, he says the other thing is, he says, on the other hand, the truth of the thoughts that are here communicated seems to be unassailable and definitive. I therefore believe myself to have found on all essential points the final solution of the problems. You know, the Nazis had the final solution. Wittgenstein had it earlier, the final solution to the philosophical problem. Yeah, all of the problems of philosophy are solved. Yeah. Yeah. And then if I'm not mistaken in this belief, then the second thing in which the value of this work consists is that it shows how little is achieved when these problems are solved. So he thinks that this work sort of solves certain problems. The final solution of all the problems of philosophy. And the sort of final solution of philosophy is to kind of, in some sense, to dissolve the problems and to recognize that the sort of problems we face, that the questions that worry us are questions that cannot be expressed in language. Take it, this is the sort of thought. Then once we realize this should somehow, is this comforting? So you've got some nagging problem and to be told these sort of worries you have, say, about the meaning of life, or whatever it is you have problems about, are problems that can't be expressed. So this is what he says in the preface. Let's run to the end of the book. So and let's look at the final. So, oh, it's 47. Shall we have a little break? Because this is a natural point to have a break. Should we do that? Okay. And then we're going to start. So, and also if you want to, you can. So 6.41. Yeah. So I'm going to start by talking about the sort of what appears to be all this weird mystical stuff at the end. Yeah, so we've got the preface and then we've got the stuff at the end, and then I'm going to go back to the beginning. So we're going to be reading the theory of meaning stuff with all of this other stuff in mind. Okay, so let's have a kind of little break, and then 10 minutes, and then we'll come back. Okay, am I back? Can you hear me? Can I hear you again?
Can you hear me,
Yeah.
Lucas?
Yeah. Major Tom to ground control. Yeah.
Professor, we cannot hear you.
So we looked at the preface, and then for most of the Tractatus, it's like the preface doesn't exist. And then I think in the sixes, towards the end of the Tractatus, he comes back to these claims. And so one of the kind of topics at the end has got to do with values. Somewhere in one letter, he said that that really he saw the Tractatus as a work in ethics. And people are like, what? It's a bit like Spinoza had his ethics, and you read it, and the first thing is, it's a long analysis of substance. You're like, hold on a minute, this is someone trying to get a job, and there are no jobs in metaphysics, so you just call what you're doing ethics. And it was this letter where Wittgenstein says the main point of the Tractatus is ethical. It was a letter to a publisher who was trying to get to publish it, and so maybe he knew that logic and metaphysics didn't sell, and was like, maybe if he kind of tried to convince someone this was really working ethics, it would make it more marketable. But doesn't sound very Wittgensteinian, that. Yeah. So one thing about his theory of meaning, I'm talking about Wittgenstein's theory of meaning. Yeah, and on the kind of reading of Wittgenstein I have, he does kind of have a theory of meaning. He is offering this picture theory of meaning as a sort of account of meaning. There's a kind of more radical reading of Wittgenstein, what's known as the sort of resolute reading that has been kind of dominant in the last 10 or 15 years. And defenders of the resolute meaning think that Wittgenstein isn't offering any sort of theory. He's just, the whole thing is sort of deconstructive. The early Wittgenstein and the later Wittgenstein are much more aligned. So the sort of, by talking about Wittgenstein's theory of meaning in the Tractatus, or account of meaning, some of these defenders of the resolute reading. So the people heard about this resolute reading. If you took a class with Chrissy last semester, you may have heard about this. So if you're interested, you can just, once again, I guess you could just look it up online. If we have time, there are other things I want to get through today, but if we have time further on in the semester, maybe I can focus a little bit more. But there's what's known as the resolute reading of the Tractatus. And this is a reading that takes Wittgenstein's claims that his own work is nonsense to be really the central thing. And so it's a reading that takes Wittgenstein's sort of goal in the Tractatus to be quite different, and that the whole idea of some sort of theory of meaning. So the big defenders of the resolute reading are Cora Diamond and James Connaught, and I'm not sure how to spell his name, so let me. So James Connaught and Cora Diamond. So if anyone's interested in this, I'm going to give you, and there's a whole kind of backwards and forwards on this. I'm actually against the resolute reading, and I tend to think that Yeah, so my approach is along the lines of hacker. So I'm going to give you, I'm giving you a couple of the key articles here. Yeah, so on the one hand, you have people like Cora Diamond and James Conant, who think that Wittgenstein really is not offering anything like a theory of meaning, and that he's not trying to show anything. I think on my reading, I'm closer to the more traditional reading. And I think the best example of this is Hacker. And Hacker's got this paper, Was He Trying to Whistle It? Because this famous economist, Schaffer at Oxford, at Cambridge at the time, said, well, if you can't say it, you can't whistle it either, because Wittgenstein was famous for whistling. And Hacker's got this paper, Was He Trying to Whistle It? And his answer is yes. Wittgenstein is trying to show us something that can't be said. Yeah, so this sort of more traditional reading takes the distinction between saying and showing to be very serious, and thinks that there are things that can be shown that can't be said. Yep, and through language, we can show people things, we can intimate things. Yeah, we can allow people to see things that literally can't be said. And so the kind of more traditional reading of the Tractatus that I sort of buy into, which is Hacker's reading, is that, yeah, Wittgenstein does think that what he says in the Tractatus is literally nonsense, but he thinks that it's something that it's a sort of nonsense that can show us something. Yeah, so there is a sort of theory of meaning that we're being shown, but the theory of meaning is something, yeah, because it relies on this notion of logical form. Logical form is something that can't be, in some sense, depicted. Yeah, so logical form, pictorial form, the spatial form of a picture is something that can't be pictured. Yeah, any picture presupposes spatial form. It's a kind of the form of the picture as well as the thing pictured. But of course, the form is something that can be revealed through the act of picturing. And so I think this is my reading of Wittgenstein. But in the chat, I've put kind of two of the key texts. On the one hand, you've got people like Conant, and on the opposite side that I'm closer to, you've got people like Hacker. Now, given this sort of theory of meaning, if there is a theory of meaning, there's a whole bunch of stuff we can't say anything about. So it turns out that one area where we can't say anything about is going to be the ethical. Yeah, so all propositions are of equal value. I think this means that kind of in some sense they're of no value. Yeah, that these propositions are just pictures. And Wittgenstein thinks that the sense of the world must lie outside the world. Yeah. In the world, yeah, the world is all that can be said. The world is, you know, the limits of my language is the limits of my world. This is something he said a bit earlier. So anything that can't be said, strictly speaking, isn't part of the world, as Wittgenstein's defined it. But then it turns out that this just tells us that this notion of the world, as it functions in sort of descriptive language, is a very limited one. And so the meaning, the sense of the world must lie outside of the world. In the world, everything is as it is, and everything happens as it does happen. Yep. There's no should, there's no ought, it turns out there's no necessity in this Wittgensteinian world. Yeah, there's no a priori. Yeah, there's no necessity, either metaphysical necessity or moral necessity. In it, so once again, he stressed the in the world, no values exist. If it did exist, it would have no value. If there is any value that does have value, it must lie outside of the whole sphere of what happens and is the case. for all that happens and is the case is accidental. Yeah, so everything that happens is contingent. Value, you may think, if you're coming from a sort of Kantian background, the ethics has to do with what must be. We have this sort of ethical must, this categorical must of moral demand. But this, because there's no necessity in this sort of Wittgensteinian world, in the world he's described, the world of facts, the world that can be depicted in descriptive language, then it turns out there are no values in the world. Yep. What makes it non-accidental cannot lie within the world, since if it did, it would itself be accidental. It, value, must lie outside the world. Yep. Now, sorry. Yeah, so it is impossible for there to be propositions of ethics. Yeah, so there can be no meaningful ethical sentences. Any ethical sentence is strictly speaking, is not meaningful. It's not descriptive. Yeah, but now these sort of claims. Once again, who asked me about Atesh? You asked me about the relationship to analytic philosophy. So the analytic philosophers read this, and well, anyone know kind of what the sort of analytical, early analytic sort of attitude that kind of takes off from this is? Any sort of thoughts? How did the kind of logical positivists read this, and then what sort of conclusions did they draw about? Well, not the early ones. I would say this is after the Second World War. And not amongst the German leftists, but amongst the sort of British who were kind of influenced, the Anglos who read some analytic philosophy. Well, anyone idea what happened in ethics after from about the 50s? What was the kind of big move in ethics? Any thoughts? What sort of isms were there?
Naturalism, maybe.
Naturalism. Anyone know any isms when it comes to ethics? Naturalism. Atesh, yeah, emotivism. That's what I was thinking of. So emotivism was kind of a bunch of Brits who'd read some logical positivism that was influenced by Wittgenstein. And emotivism says that, strictly speaking, ethical statements are not true or false. Ethical statements are not descriptive. So what are ethical statements? Well, they're just the expression of feeling. When I say something is bad, I'm not saying anything. I'm just showing you how I feel. Yeah, so if I say, oh, Zeynep is immoral, yep, I'm not describing Zeynep. I'm not making a statement that has sort of any truth value to it. It's a statement that has no descriptive content. Instead, all I'm doing is expressing how I feel. I'm expressing my emotions. Yeah, so emotivism is a version of what became known as expressivism. That emotivism is the view that ethical statements are just expressions of feelings. I think the kind of first big defender of emotivism was this guy Stevenson. And then you have a general view that is called expressivism, where you have the idea that ethical statements are not descriptive, but they're expressive. You're expressing something rather than saying something. You might think that this sort of distinction between saying and expressing might kind of map onto the sort of Wittgensteinian distinction between saying and showing. When I make a moral judgment explicitly in language, I'm just sort of showing you how I feel. I'm expressing my feelings. And so I take it that that this sort of claim about ethics was read by analytic philosophers and led them to kind of put forward views like expressivism and emotivism, with the idea that logical now I think that Wittgenstein himself was more in some sense, more mystical than this. So I take it that those philosophers into emotivism and expressivism, one of their key concerns is a form of ethical naturalism. Yeah, that they want to fit the ethical into our natural world of science. It seems to me, though, that Wittgenstein, I think, is going in the other direction. Yeah, so Wittgenstein here says that, you know, propositions can express nothing that is higher. Yeah, it is clear that ethics cannot be put into words. Ethics is transcendental. Ethics and aesthetics are one and the same. Yeah, so, you know, so here he's not, it seems to me that his views on ethics are not in the service of a form of naturalism. So when we're looking at post-war ethics, ethics became meta-ethics. And instead of doing ethics, what we do is we spend our time in ethics classes looking at the language we use in making ethical statements. And we're interested in the semantics, you know, of, so in meta-ethics, what we look at are the semantics of ethical language. Then we say, oh, ethical language is not descriptive, it's expressive, it's expression of emotions. We want an account of ethics that allows us a naturalistic understanding of the ethical. It seems to me Wittgenstein, on my understanding, rejects that. He's a sort of transcendentalist, a sort of mystic who thinks that there is something real there, but it's beyond the limits of language. Atesh and then Lockman. Yeah.
Do you think he's being anti-Kantian here in the sense that what is transcendental cannot be expressed or put into propositions?
I mean, it's not obvious because in some sense, I think, I mean, there's an interesting question there. So I haven't thought so much about Wittgenstein's ethics and its relationship to Kantian and whether, so one thing is that he does seem to kind of talk about ethical laws. And I think it turns out that ethical laws, like the categorical imperative, is not going to be a proposition. Yeah. That it's impossible for there to be propositions of ethics. And claims of the form, thou shalt, yeah, like imperatives, for Wittgenstein can't be propositions, because imperatives express some sort of necessity, and then there's no necessity in the world, according to Wittgenstein, the world of that can be described. Yeah, and so he says when an ethical law of the form thou shalt is laid down, yep, he says it is clear, however, that ethics has nothing to do with punishment and reward in the usual sense of the terms. Yep. So our questions about the consequence of an action must be unimportant. So here you might think this sounds quite Kantian in a certain sense. Ethics doesn't have to do with the consequences of one's actions, but it's got to do with a certain type of necessity. But of course, the world, there is no necessity in the world as it can be described by science. That is why ethics is transcendental. Now, his remarks on ethics are very limited. Now, the claim that ethics and aesthetics are one and the same, it seems to me that's, you know, in some sense, I think maybe he's closer to Plato. You know, that you have the good and the beautiful, and that, you know, these are things that I guess we can't, except like there's a sort of mysticism here in Wittgenstein, because we can't say anything about the good. But I take it the sort of thought is that the beautiful is something that can be experienced, but it can't be described. Like, you know, as Wordsworth said, you have to murder to dissect. So if you've got a beautiful poem and then you try and describe its beauty, it sort of destroys the poem. Like you've got a joke, and if you've got to explain to someone what makes it funny, that sort of destroys the funniness. Yeah. So I take it ethics and aesthetics are one and the same. There's a sort of this sort of transcendental aesthetic ecstasy type of moment where one has this sort of experience of beauty, and this experience of beauty is not the experience of some other fact in the world. The experience of beauty in some sense is a revelation of something beyond the world. That's my sort of take on what Wittgenstein's view is. He's got this sort of mystical idea of some sort of mystical experience of non-natural view about the ethical. And this is why I think that even though Wittgenstein these sort of ideas were sort of taken up by emotivists and expressivists in the task of naturalizing the ethical. And I don't think Wittgenstein's in that game. Lokman.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
There is a criticism about the ethic in Wittgenstein by Ahmet Arslan.
Yeah.
Arslan said Wittgenstein gives religion a great chance for define ethics like this. Ethics is transcendent, and Ahmet Arslan as doesn't philosophy inability to talk about ethics push people to ideology and religion in their quest to do right thing?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that. Okay.
If the philosopher cannot speak here, I'm here as a priest and imam. I can speak for God.
Yeah. So, I mean, so we've got this stuff about ethics. Then on the next page, I mean, he's just talked about logic. So you've got a text, you've got this book about logic, and then suddenly it's suddenly like ethics. Then it's about death. Death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. So in some sense, death is not something that is part of the world. It's not something that's our own death anyway. He talks about eternity, once again, the timelessness. But then he starts talking about God. And on my sort of reading, this stuff about ethics and God sort of go together. So unlike the sort of appropriations of Wittgenstein after the Second World War, where it's put in the service of naturalism, I think that Wittgenstein himself has this sort of mystical, and this is how he's very different from Russell. So Russell was a good old card-carrying atheist, and Wittgenstein is this, I think, more of a sort of religious mystic. Now, Wittgenstein's family background is Jewish, but I think there's a kind of, it's not obviously it's a Jewish mysticism. There's something quite Protestant, I think, about his sort of mysticism, because it seems to me it's a sort of private relationship to God. Like religion is not something social, it's very much a sort of individual relationship to God. So he says, how things are in the world is a matter of complete indifference for what is higher. God does not reveal himself in the world. So I think this ties in to this ties into the sort of ethical view. We've got this religious side that God does not reveal himself in the world. How things are in the world is a matter of complete indifference for what is higher. And this involves the sort of aestheticization, I think, of ethics, that in some sense, what's important ethically is just the state of your soul, maybe. And so anything you do in the world, that doesn't really matter. It's a sort of ethics that's sort of detached from the world. You might think an ethics that's detached from the world is an ethics in which action isn't important, because action in the world is something in the world. And that's why you might think, oh, what's important are these moments of experience of beauty. You have these aesthetic moments And that's what the ethical is about these moments of, yeah. So I think his sort of I think Wittgenstein's ethics, I mean, I think Wittgenstein is very much coming out of this sort of tradition of German Romanticism when it comes to these sort of things, where you have this sort of mysticism, you have the idea of, you know, this is what Hegel was criticizing, I think, partially in his idea of the beautiful soul. So you had these German romantics who wanted to aestheticize the ethical. And what's really important in ethics is having a beautiful soul. And you identify the good and the beautiful. It's a sort of ethics that I think is cut off from any sort of social responsibility because it's not a worldly ethics. Yeah. So if we think the good, if we think ethics has got to do with the good and good is something higher, then how things are in the world is a matter of complete indifference for ethics. You might think that's a bit weird. Yeah, you've got a sort of ethics that says how things actually are in the world. You might think how things are in the world, kind of what you do, how things unfold in the world. You know, you could be enslaved, there could be fascism, there could be, you know, you could, that doesn't really matter for ethics. Ethics is about the higher is something, that you have this kind of slightly existentialist sort of move here, that it is not how things are in the world that is mystical, but that it exists. The fact of being, that's what mystical. Now we've got this stuff about the mystical, about the ethical, about the transcendent, about the eternal. So we've got this up to 6.5. But then we suddenly had this sort of change of tone. Yeah, so here we've got the sort of, so before we've got the idea that we've got this sort of mystical that can be experienced but can't be said. But then now we've got this change of tone that seems to be saying that all of these problems of philosophy and that we kind of dissolve all of these. Yeah, so the sort of passages we're now looking at can be read in a very non-mystical way, in the way of, you know, that we basically realize that all of these problems of life and death and meaning are meaningless, and we just dissolve them. So he says, when the answer cannot be put into words, neither can the question be put into words. The riddle does not exist. So rather than thinking there are certain things that are a matter of transcendent experience, we now have the idea that there are certain things we're worried about philosophically that only arise because of language and because we take certain questions as meaningful. Yeah, and the sort of thought here is that a question is only meaningful if it can be answered, if there's something that would count as an answer. And if we ask what is the meaning of life, then we might think, well, what would an answer to that look like? And if you can't give any account of what it would be to answer that question, then the sort of thought is, well, the question itself seems a really meaningless question. So what's the meaning of life? 42, you know, like, is that, you know, is that, I mean, unless you've got some idea of what an answer would look like, yeah, then these sort of questions. So if a question can be framed at all, it is also possible to answer it. Now, Wittgenstein says, well, we feel that even when all possible scientific questions have been answered, the problem of life remains completely untouched. But of course, then there are no questions left, and this itself is the answer. So the answer, I mean, these sort of philosophical, so here it looks like there's one side of Wittgenstein that seems to think, well, he's a sort of mystic. He believes in this sort of transcendent experience. You have these transcendent experiences that can put you in touch with things like beauty and with things like obligation. Maybe there is some ought. Wittgenstein himself, I think, was a real prig and a bit of a moralist. So Wittgenstein himself really had all of these sort of rules and, you know, how things should be done and Yeah, so he was someone who did have quite rigid codes, very kind of weird Wittgensteinian types of things. But here he seems to be kind of, so the stuff before 6.5, we seem to have this more mystical side. From 6.5 onwards, we have these things that look like this sort of debunking of philosophical problems. Yeah, so he says here that the solution of the problem of life is seen in the vanishing of the problem. Yeah, that once if we take Wittgenstein at face value and we buy into this account of meaning, then it turns out that all of these questions that may have worried us philosophically are just nonsense. This is the kind of Carnapian take. So I gave you the link to Carnap's account of how we kind of solve all of these metaphysical problems through the analysis of language. And we come to realize that the questions themselves are sort of nonsense. Yeah, and so we can stop worrying. Now here he says that there are indeed things that cannot be put into words, but these things that cannot be put into words make themselves manifest. They are what is mystical. Yeah, so once again, this is the sort of reading that I like of Wittgenstein, the early Wittgenstein, is he thinks that there are things that cannot be put into words, but can be made manifest, can be shown, can be, yeah, and this is the mystical. So the mystic, what Wittgenstein is calling the mystical is that which can be shown, but not said. So we're in the final couple of paragraphs here. So I just want to read through these because I think to work out what to make of Wittgenstein as a whole, I think we have to think about what to make of these final paragraphs. So now he's giving an account of the correct method of philosophy. And it seems like the worry is if this is the correct method of philosophy, then the whole of the Tractatus has been getting it wrong. So it looks like you might think that he wrote the Tractatus. At the end of the Tractatus, he realized, actually, if I'm right, everything I've just written is wrong. This is the sort of thought. So the correct method in philosophy would be really to be the following: to say nothing except what can be said, i.e. propositions of natural science. Yeah. Sorry, let me. Yep. I.e. something that has nothing to do with philosophy. So anything, the correct method of philosophy is sort of to not do philosophy, because all that can be said clearly are going to be a matter of natural science. So, you know, so say nothing except what can be said, i.e. propositions of natural science. And these propositions of natural science have nothing to do with philosophy. And then whenever someone else wanted to say something metaphysical, yeah, so the correct method of philosophy is not to say anything, unless someone else tries to say something metaphysical, in which case to demonstrate to him that he had failed to give a meaning to certain signs in his propositions. So the correct way to do philosophy is to not do it, is to do what you can to avoid it. And if other people insist on doing it, try and show them that what they're saying is meaningless. Wittgenstein, like Socrates, could be really annoying. Yeah, you know, anything you say, Wittgenstein's going to say, hold on a minute, what do you mean? That's nonsense. You haven't said anything. Yeah. Although it would not be satisfying to the other person. Yeah. You can imagine what it's like, kind of having a conversation with Wittgenstein. Russell, after kind of having all these conversations with Wittgenstein, basically gave up doing philosophy in some sense. Yeah, it was just too much. It was like, yep. Although it would not be satisfying, you know, I think this is the kind of understatement here. It'll be really annoying, really effing annoying. Yeah, it would not be satisfying to the other person. He would not have the feeling that we were teaching him philosophy. This method would be the only strictly correct one. So the proper method of philosophy is to dissolve the philosophical problems by showing that people who are engaging in this type of philosophy, engaging in metaphysics, are talking nonsense. Yeah. So Tesh, once again, this is the sort of early analytic attack on metaphysics. This is where it's sort of coming from. So if you want to understand the relationship between Wittgenstein and analytic philosophy, I think it kind of runs through Carnap. So the kind of Carnap, the elimination of metaphysics through the logical analysis of language, I think is a key sort of text. So this looks like, I mean, but Wittgenstein himself isn't doing this. So you might think, well, surely there are things, surely if Wittgenstein can show us something through the use of meaningless language, surely isn't there going to be a role for showing people things through language that is strictly speaking nonsense? Yeah. You might think kind of, you've got Carnap is the heir of Wittgenstein, but you might think Derrida in a certain sense. Yeah. You know, is that what Derrida is doing? You've got stuff that is strictly speaking nonsense, but can be revealing in a certain way. Yeah. So if, I mean, so this paragraph seems to be quite anti-mystical. You know, this paragraph says, well, the correct method in philosophy is very limited. Yeah, it's a negative discipline. This is sort of philosophy as therapy, where you've got these people who have these sort of metaphysical urges, and then the correct method of philosophy is to cure people of these metaphysical urges by showing people who are trying to say stuff that is metaphysical that what they're trying to say is meaningless. Yeah. And then this is the kind of end of it. My proposition serves as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me, so if you read this book and understand it, eventually recognizes them as nonsensical. So anyone who reads this book and fully understands it realizes that everything I say in this book is nonsense when he has used them as steps to climb beyond them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed at it. So like we've got this book that is made up of stuff that is strictly speaking nonsense, but when you first start reading it, you don't take it as nonsense. But if you sort of understand it, you come to see it as nonsense. But then if it's nonsense though, the idea is, well, how can you come to understand it? Yeah, if it really is nonsense, it can't make sense to think, well, when you understand what I say, you'll realize what it's nonsense. Yeah, there's nothing there to be understood. Is there? Or are you going to think, well, there are things that can be thought that can't be expressed in language? Is the argument, does the kind of way things work here work by thinking, yeah, we can sort of understand Wittgenstein even though it's nonsense, because there are things that can be thought that can't be said. Yeah. He must transcend these propositions, and then he will see the world aright. So in some sense, reading the book, the Tractatus, is supposed to, and this is why I think Wittgenstein saw his work as sort of ethical. You know, that Plato thought that the task of philosophy is a sort of reorientation. Yeah, so you know, at the end of the allegory of the cave, that the task of philosophy is a sort of turning of the soul. Yeah, that it's a sort of conversion. Vertio is the Latin for turn, so conversion is a sort of turning. Yeah, and this sort of the goal of philosophy, according to Plato, is this form of what we acquire as a sort of reorientation. I think maybe this is what Wittgenstein's suggesting here. Yeah, the book is supposed to reorient the reader. Yeah, the idea is we're supposed to read this book and we sort of transcend the propositions. And this transcending the propositions leads to a sort of reorientation, that we see the world aright. Yeah, so the goal of the Tractatus, as we seem to suggest here, yeah, so what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. I mean, is this Wittgenstein taking the piss? Because the whole book is supposed to be stuff that we cannot speak about. And he hasn't passed over it in silence. Yeah, so I think there's a sort of, yeah, I mean, we should throw away the ladder, but yeah, so I think the end of the Tractatus is very puzzling, and the beginning. And if you're interested, I suggested there's this big debate, and we've got these two sides. If I manage to get through enough of the stuff, then maybe I'll do a little class on talking about the debate and say a bit more about it and introduce you to the sides. But if you want to, you can read that for yourself. Atesh?
So what I want to ask is, what would he say about the language of Tractatus? I mean, whistling,
Yeah.
and this act of showing, is it a non-propositional kind of language? I mean, are there two kinds of language, which one is propositional and the other non-propositional?
I mean, yeah, so he's not clear, is he? So Wittgenstein himself wrote this, and then he kind of he said, I'm giving up philosophy. And then he went off to kind of become a school teacher and hated kids, got thrown out because he kept beating up the kind of 10-year-olds. And then he went to live in a kind of farmhouse in Norway. And then he started to realize that his whole philosophy didn't work. And then he kind of got back into philosophy. But he's sort of he dropped this bomb, and then he was like, okay, that's it, I've solved the problem. So yeah, it's very difficult to know. So, some people influenced by Wittgenstein, this sort of way of thinking, as I suggested, said, oh, then we can just distinguish between two types of sentences. Those sentences that express propositions and those that don't. So that's what the expressivists did. Oh, we've got non-descriptive language, and non-descriptive language is not truth apt, it doesn't say anything about the world, it has another function. Yeah, so so one way you could go is just to make a dividing line between two different ways of using language, or two different types of, two different types. There's different ways you could go here, because I think the expressivists want to say, well, there are two different types of sentence. Well, there's lots of different types of sentences. You've got complete nonsense, like gobbly-bob, doesn't mean anything. But then you've got kind of things that are, Zeynep is very bad. Yeah, that looks like a descriptive sentence. It does have a meaning, but it's got a non-descriptive meaning. It's an expressive sentence. Yeah. You might think, though, that the same sort of sentences, so in poetry, for example, you may have a bunch of sentences that individually are all descriptive and meaningful, but when taken together may have a kind of poetic meaning. They may have aesthetic value. So my guess is Wittgenstein wouldn't like this idea of, oh, there are two types of sentences, the meaningful ones, and then the sentences that show you things. Yeah, so I don't think he would have, the young Wittgenstein, I don't think would have liked the emotivists. But, I mean, but not, so I think one thing, though, is that Wittgenstein thinks that not all nonsense is on a par. Yeah. So that not all nonsense is the same, because the Tractatus is nonsense, but it's sort of useful nonsense. Yeah. So there's some nonsense, Heidegger is, you might think, well, Heidegger's bad nonsense, Carnap might think, because he's a Nazi, but Wittgenstein maybe is good nonsense. Yeah, so there is, I think for Wittgenstein, yeah, not all nonsense is on a par, because some nonsense is, some uses of language that is explicitly meaningless, is explicitly nonsense, can be revealing in certain ways. Yeah, and it's yeah, that's my sort of reading of Wittgenstein, that you know, like the Tractatus is more like pornography. It's supposed to affect you in a certain way. It's supposed to affect your mind in a certain way and lead to a certain type of reorientation. Yeah, it's supposed to give you a sort of mental reorientation. Yeah, that it's supposed to affect the way you think rather than saying something. Yeah, just like pornography is, you know, it's supposed to affects your body. It doesn't say anything, but it has this sort of effect. And I think that that's the sort of goal of the Tractatus. It's supposed to be something that sort of changes the reader. Yeah, that it helps you to see the world aright. Yeah, so it changes the kind of your demeanor towards the world, your orientation, and so yeah. So, but I don't think he wants to think there are two types of sentence. Yeah, because I think that, yeah, I think he's far too much of a sort of mystic, and he's too much into the aesthetic. Yeah, I think he believes in beauty. Yeah, so I think Wittgenstein, you know, like music, and you know that beauty is something that is not, you know, is something that can be shown. If something beautiful, I point at the sunset, and you look at it. Yeah, and we can kind of share that experience of the beautiful. And so I think, yeah, the claim that the ethical and the aesthetic, yeah, this is why I think he's more of a Platonist, because in Plato you have, you know, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Yeah, that you know, the one that is beyond being. And I think that's sort of that's my sort of take of what's really going on behind this. But I think it is quite, yeah, it's not obvious. So next class, so tomorrow, yeah, let's not do it tomorrow, because let's hope my cold clears up. But even so, yeah, I'm not going to have a COVID test, because I think that's, you know, annoying. Yeah, and so next class we'll talk about the theory of meaning, the picture theory of meaning. And I started working through the handout I gave you. And for the picture theory of meaning, if you can understand kind of the 2-page handout I gave you, that's good for an introduction to the Tractatus course. And I'm going to work through that and talk a bit about the picture theory and how this applies and the way in which sentence. So we got the picture theory of meaning, and we can understand how picturing works. Yeah, so I think from what I said before the break, if you understood that, I think, but then the question is how, in what sense are sentences pictures? How can we understand of sentences to be pictures? I think this is, yeah, quite difficult. Yeah, and it's we've got the kind of analogy between kind of spatial form of a painting. Yeah, that's the sort of, but then we have the notion of logical form, and what sense are we to make of this? And I'll try and say something about that. Okay, so I'll see you next week, and I hope you all had a good Bayram, and yeah, bye-bye. Ciao.